Welcome to Lyric Lab Poetry. My name is Martin Jago, and as you can see, I've got a new mirror in the Lyric Lab Poetry office, and I'm very excited about it. And I've got another one just over here behind the door, so I can now run between the two mirrors, looking at myself longingly. And with a face like this, who wouldn't? Yeah? You know what I mean? Welcome to Lyric Lab Poetry. As you've probably guessed, the subject of mirrors is the focus of today's video. The idea of mirrors as poetic portals, as a really good springboard into our own creative process. So let's get started. There's actually so much to unpack here. The first thing that springs to mind is the idea of reflection, of course, of light, of refraction, and also parallel lines. These are really interesting areas to explore from a poetic perspective. The first thing I think that comes to mind is probably the myth of Narcissus. Now, when I first bought this mirror, I hung it on the wall here. I left the room, I came back, I'd forgotten that it was here. And do you know what I thought? I thought, my God, Martin, what a beautiful example of classical portraiture you've got hanging on the wall. And then I realized it was a mirror. The second thing is from the fairy tale, of course. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? Let's just say in casting terms, Martin, you are what we would call real to character-y, great face for radio. And the third thing that comes to mind is a wonderful poem by Sylvia Plath called Mirror. I will put a link in the description to that poem. It's really wonderful. The mirror speaks, the mirror has a voice, and that gets me thinking about what the mirror sees that we don't see, or what the mirror doesn't see also. That's a very interesting subject for a poem. In terms of classic poetic metaphor, we think in terms of self-reflection, identity, duality. These are things that come to mind when we think of the relationship between the subject and the mirror. Also, parallelism is something that's very widely used in literature. If you think of Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, or Hamlet, to be or not to be, this kind of oppositional duality. That's something a little different, I think, although it can certainly extend to this idea of mirroring and mirrors in poetry. One thing I see from time to time, and I've never experimented with this, is the idea of parallel text. That's a really good place to start with this idea of mirroring, this parallel text. A parallel text poem would be maybe where you have two stanzas that are placed horizontally, in other words, side by side on the page, rather than vertically, one under the other. And so you're kind of forced to read it, or your brain wants to read from left to right across the page. And so the poem can make sense in different ways. You could read all of the first stanza in the left-hand column, and then all of the stanza in the right-hand column, or you could read across the first line of the first stanza onto the first line of the second stanza. That's really, really intriguing because it gives room for the poet to really play with layers of meaning, something I talk about often with reference to line breaks. This is like that, but more so. Let's think about writing a poem in which a mirror tells the subject, tells the speaker in the poem a truth that they don't want to know. Or actually, let's have it that the mirror is the speaker in the poem and tells the object, the person that they're speaking to, a truth about themselves that they might not want to know or hear. Since mirrors have so much to do with light and the way light works scientifically, refraction is also a really interesting concept for a poem. So in this prompt, you're going to describe a moment that shaped you, bent you maybe, but didn't break you. I tried to write a poem in a mirror once, but it all came out backwards. This is Bare Fiction, literary magazine, poetry, theatre and fiction, a really wonderful magazine. This is issue 1. Sadly, Bare Fiction is no longer with us, but it really was a poetic, tour de force, a literary tour de force, brainchild of Rob Harper, a UK-based poet, and many, many decades ago, Rob and I trained together as actors, so it's wonderful that we both ended up in poetry. However, the poem I was looking for, it may have been on the website, so if Rob ever gets around to watching this video, then maybe he could jog my memory, but I'm sure it was in Bare Fiction. And if not, I've just given Bare Fiction and Rob Harper a really good plug. They both deserve it. So the poem appeared on the page in 2 stanzas. And the first stanza, I believe, was a series of questions. And the second stanza, each successive line answered in order the questions that had been posed in stanza 1. And it had this kind of feel of a poem that was reflecting on itself, which is why it comes to mind. That's a really interesting device structurally to experiment with. If you can just think of a handful of questions, just write down questions that come into your head and then see if you can play with this as a prompt to answer in the following stanza. But maybe also we want to employ an element of surprise, maybe even shock or confusion. What happens if we mix up our answers to the questions so that the wrong answer appears to answer the right question, if you know what I mean? Here's another quick prompt for you. Write a poem in reverse order. So you actually start the poem with the last line and you finish with the first line. What changes? Now, in the bathroom, I have a couple of more mirrors. I have one above the sink and another one which is on the cabinet, the bathroom cabinet, which I sometimes open, and this enables me to see the side of my own head as I'm cutting it, because if you haven't already guessed, I cut my own hair. I use a pair of clippers, and in order to do that relatively reasonably, I use this kind of 2 mirrors. Now if I keep opening the mirror which is on the cabinet fixed to the wall, so it's facing the mirror above the sink, you create this pattern of infinite reflection. That is a very interesting subject for exploration in terms of a poetry prompt. If you think about time itself repeating, or if you think about how things are mirrored through generations. I was sadly at a funeral recently, and the eldest son of the deceased, who doesn't really look much like the deceased, there are some sort of, surface resemblances, of course, but really, it was the mannerisms, it was the way this person held themselves that really, really reminded me of their father. And that's also really interesting to think about how when someone's gone, they kind of remain, how things are carried through or mirrored from one generation to the next. That could also be toxic. It's often said that things like addiction are generational. So consider a poem that maybe is about history repeating itself. And then also the idea of being stuck in a mental loop is also a very interesting idea that relates to this idea of infinite reflection. Think about an emotion that you thought you had escaped, that comes back and you think is gone, but actually keeps rearing its head. There are, of course, a couple of poetic forms that are really worth playing with. If you take one of these poetry prompts and then try to write it in the Pantoum form or the villanelle as a villanelle, and you will discover that lines that are repeated throughout the poem really actually create their own sort of poem and their own rhythm. And this idea of reflection is held within that repeat, within those refrains. Mirror in the bathroom, please talk free, the door is locked, just you and me. The lyrics to a song called Mirror in the Bathroom by The Beat. Please go and check it out on YouTube right now. I'm going to put a link in the description to a little slice of my childhood, the ska movement, but specifically this brilliant song. So mirrors as poetic portals, reflection, refraction, light and perspective. Poetry bends light, and sometimes, like a mirror, it shows us who we are, but it also has the power to show us who or what we might become. Thank you very much for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed the video. Please do click on the like button and the subscribe button. It really helps the channel to grow. And of course, I will be back very soon with more poetry content. So what you're telling me is that it takes time for the light to travel from the surface of the mirror back to me, in through my eyes, into my brain, and so that by the time that's actually processed, that means that actually I'm actually younger than I look. No, that's not right.